Amen. Thank you. All right, so we're going to look at the latter portion of Numbers, and we're covering huge chunks of Scripture, and I know it's a lot to keep up with. It is for me anyway. But my hope is, among other things, that we kind of get a general idea of each of these books so that when we say the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, we get an overall view of what each book is about. I think we know anyway, but maybe if we just keep going over these and just the structure in a very general way, then it all starts to fit together a little better. At least it does for me. So we will look at those in a minute. Let's begin with the review that we had at the start of our lesson. And let me just get something else situated here. Let's see. Okay. All right, you've had time to look at that, so let's go through these. Number one, the people were pleased with their progress until they got to Kadesh Barnea. So, Kadesh Barnea is where? Okay, it's on the way up. The place they stopped before they got to the land, sent the spies in. Would you say the people were pleased with their progress up until that time? I see no. Because they were complaining, weren't they? So I think we would disagree with that. They had their complaints even as they left, and it probably wasn't all that long a journey up there, but there were issues, weren't there? Number two, it is easy to understand why the people complain so much. You could answer that one or two. You could answer that either way, couldn't you? Because you could say, yeah, I understand why they complain like they did, because it's human nature. On the other hand, you could say, but they really shouldn't have, because God was taking care of them. So depending on what we mean by it's easy to understand, I guess we could go either way. I think I had disagree with that, thinking that God had taken care of them, so they really shouldn't have complained, but we know what we are like, don't we? All right, number three, the 10 spies and the people should have recognized that God would enable them to take the land of Canaan. Okay, and who makes that case? Yeah, Joshua and Caleb, the other two spies, try to convince them otherwise, unsuccessfully. Number four, the people still complain despite 40 years of wilderness wandering. That really gets into tonight's lesson. We didn't get that far, but you can probably guess the answer to this one. Yes, they do continue to complain right off the bat. We'll see. Number five, when God caused Aaron's rod to bud, it provided proof that he and his sons were to serve as priests. Okay, I think that's the one we ended with last time. And Korah and his group approached and said, why are you taking this all on yourself? And so God judged them, and then the people got upset at Moses and Aaron. And then I think it was Moses who said, each leader of the tribe bring this rod in the morning, and we'll see whom God has chosen. And it was Aaron. All right, so that's just a little bit of a review of what we did last time. So let's just think overall again about each of these books. Leviticus, what do we start out with in Leviticus? What's the first 7 chapters about? Yeah, ritual sacrifices. So if you can think sacrifices, we're calling them ritual. Chapters 8 to 10, the shift goes to the priests who are making the sacrifices. They're ordained to serve. What happens in chapter 10 that's noteworthy? Nadab and Abihu are judged for offering strange fire. So right off the bat, a very severe judgment against them. Chapters 11 to 15, what would you... Okay, yeah, we've got ritual purity. Chapter 11 is that chapter on clean and unclean animals, among other things, leprosy, mold in the house, different things like that. Then right in the middle, chapter 16 and 17, Day of Atonement. All right, and then on the way back, should be a little bit easier. What about the 18 to 20? What kind of purity? Moral purity. And then chapters 21 and 22, qualifications of priests, some things that had to be true if they were to serve. And then we end with what? Ritual feasts that were to be held. All right? And the theme? Be what? Be holy because I am holy. Okay, good. All right, and so you've got this tabernacle in the center of the camp with God wanting to dwell there, and yet man is excluded. The priests have to serve God. Only the high priest can go in one time a year and make sacrifice year after year, all of which says that things aren't as they ought to be. Okay, so last time we looked at, actually the last couple of times, Israel at Mount Sinai after a year, preparing to go on. God's given them the basis for this covenant. And we just talked about the priesthood, the tabernacle. The law, of course, is the basis for that covenant, is the covenant. So they're getting ready to journey into the land. So we've got three major sections here. And the three places are Mount Sinai, the wilderness of Paran. Where is the wilderness of Paran? I mean, what's that have to do with? What's that middle part? We mentioned it a moment ago, not using Paran, but something else. Kadesh Barnea. So that's the area that they go to before they send the spies in. All right? So they make their way from Mount Sinai to the wilderness of Paran, and that's the travel in between. So from south there up to Kadesh Barnea, the wilderness of Paran, and then the spies go into the land. And then the other move is from the wilderness of Paran to the plains of Moab. Where are the plains of Moab? What's that have to do with? Okay, it's east of the Promised Land, east of the Jordan, and right across from Canaan. So they're going to make their way up to that point after doing what? Wandering for 40 years. And it's interesting, in chapter 33, there's not much said about that 40 years of wandering. It's kind of a place-by-place listing of all that period of time, and a couple of verses devoted to those 40 years. So not a lot said about it, but they eventually make their way up. And so we'll talk a little bit about going past Edom and through Moab on their way up to camp. Okay, so lots of stuff going on there, but we're going to just try to narrow it down. We talked last time about this first leg of the journey from Sinai up to Paran. They complained about the conditions. They complained about the food. Miriam and Aaron complained about Moses having so much authority. And then we talked about the spies going into the land, coming back with this evil report. Joshua and Caleb giving a good report, and God judging them as a result. And then Korah and his group, most of whom were from the Levitical tribe, but some of whom were from the tribe of Reuben. God judges them, but kind of the same issue. Why are you taking all this on yourself in terms of Aaron and the priesthood? And that's chapter 17 is where Moses says, take these rods and God will choose who's going to serve him. All right, so there's Kadesh Barnea. There are the spies going up to the land, the length of the land during the 40 days. How did God determine how long to judge them in their wilderness wandering? 1 day for each year. Okay, 40 days equals 40 years. All right, so now we're ready for chapters 20 and 21. So this is during this period of wilderness wandering, not a lot said about that per se, but we're told about some things that happen around it. So in chapter 20, so we've got that lower portion there, in and around Kadesh Barnea. Mount Hor is mentioned there. We'll note that as we go along. Miriam's death is recorded in verse 1 of chapter 20. So, of course, that's significant. We talked about Miriam and Aaron kind of getting upset about their brother having all this leadership, but she was important. She was special. Her death is noted. And then the people complain yet again. And this time, what's the complaint? Yeah, it has to do with water. And what does God tell Moses and Aaron to do? Now, they've had this problem before, no water to drink. They did that before they got to Sinai. Okay. And what's he tell Moses and Aaron to do? Speak to the rock. And Moses and Aaron, apparently upset with the people, and I think we could all appreciate that. They do what? What does Moses do? He strikes the rock twice. The water comes out, but the consequences are that Moses, you have disobeyed, and as a result of that, you're not going to be able to go into the land. Give me just another second here. Okay. So, looking for my verses. All right. So he says, he tells them to speak to the rock. Then verse 10, Moses upset, chapter 20 there. Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Lifts up his hand, strikes the rock twice. And then listen to what God says, verse 12. Because you did not believe in me. Did they believe in him? Obviously, Moses has been leading the people for a long time. But what? They just failed to respect what his will was. And so he says, you'll not bring this assembly into the land that I've given. Okay, so that's a hard blow there, isn't it? That he's not going to be able to go into the land after all this that has taken place. All right, so there's the painful discipline that takes place. And the next thing that's recorded there is they're making their way toward the land. What does Moses request from the king of Edom? Yeah, he says, let us go through the land. I don't have the map handy here, but we just saw it. So Edom is between going up to Moab and where they are at Kadesh Barnea. Can we pass through the land? With what promise? What does he say? We won't do what? Yeah, we won't plunder your land as we go through. We won't touch anything. Okay. And Edom's answer? Not going to let you do it. And in fact, they bring out some of their men, to verse 20. Came out against them with a large army and a strong force, and thus they refused to give Israel passage. So we said that they apparently make a route around the land, and a lot longer journey than it would have been. And then in chapter 20, verses 22 to 29, Aaron's death is recorded at Mount Hor. And that was back over there close to Kadesh Barnea, so not sure about the exact order of all of this. But who takes the place of Aaron? All right, his son Eleazar, and he assumes this role of high priest. And so Aaron dies, and the people mourn for 30 days. All right, so start of the chapter, Miriam dies. End of the chapter, Aaron dies. And here's Moses now, without his brother and sister. And he's been told he's not going to go into the land. And so what's he do? Does he sit down and decide, I can't go on? He gets back up and just keeps going on, doesn't he? Okay? So you think of this in human terms, a lot of this might be difficult to take. And then chapter 21, the complaints continue. Although at the start of the chapter there is this battle that they have with the Canaanites. And apparently this is one of the people who are kind of blocking the way in there. And so the people say, if you'll give us this people, we'll devote their cities to destruction. Verse 3, the Lord heeds the voice of Israel and gives the Canaanites to them. So remember, previously, at the end of chapter 14, after they'd been told they're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, they go up and try to take that land, and they're defeated. Now, God is with them, and he allows them to defeat the Canaanites here. So it makes a difference whose side they are on and how they go about doing what they do. Okay, and then, again, this complaining, verses 4 and 5. Have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? No food and no water. Just seems like a repeat of what happens before. And this time, what does God send among them? We've had fire, we've had plague. This time there are serpents. And how does God choose to save them when they seem to confess their sin? Yeah, there's a bronze serpent that's lifted up among them, and those who look upon this bronze serpent are cleansed from the bite of the serpent. Any lesson to learn there? I mean, that seems like kind of a unique way to do things. Okay, all right. God is looking for penitence, and he responds to that penitence. And it's interesting because what does Jesus say about this over in John chapter 3, or maybe it's John's gospel? I don't know if it's John or if it's Jesus, but John chapter 3, what is this compared to over there? Do you remember? Okay, it talks about Jesus being lifted up. Verse 14 of John 3, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And there's kind of a similarity in that Jesus is being made this one who's going to die on behalf of the people. And the faith of those who have this sin needs to be placed in the Son of Man. And that's the emphasis there in chapter 3. All right. So all that having to do with that event. Yeah, Rick? Yes. Okay. Is it Hezekiah? I couldn't think of who it was where they kind of rediscover this. How do you account for that? That this bronze serpent later becomes kind of a object of worship all in itself. Is that hard to imagine? Do people tend to worship things that seem to have a Okay. Yeah, God didn't want objects of worship other than himself. He was opposed to idolatry, so they took something that had served a good purpose, and yet it became an object of idolatry. So it can happen, can't it? And we've got to be careful to discern between what's truly important and not letting something else become an object that's in our way. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, it certainly seems like individuals are inclined toward reverencing something that might have some little bit of power or, yeah, okay. So, interesting, yes. Thank you for bringing that in. Okay, let's look at this last section, chapters 22 to 36. So, they're making their way around to Edom. They're coming up into the land with that direction. And as they get up to Moab, you have this occasion where Balaam is called upon by Balak, the king of Moab. What does Balak want Balaam to do? Come and curse this people. Why is he saying that? They've been defeating some people, haven't they? And they're going to defeat some other people right in this same context. And Balak seems concerned about that. I was just thinking today about this whole matter. Taking a group of people this large, moving them from Egypt up over to this place, but not just moving them there. This is their land that they're going in to take, but somebody's in the land. I mean, this is all a huge undertaking, isn't it? This doesn't just happen overnight. And Balak is concerned about this because he sees what's happening around him, and he's reacting to that. Kind of interesting, he calls upon Balaam. Who's Balaam? He's a prophet. We don't know a lot about him. We don't know a lot about the background. On this occasion, at least, where does the prophecy of Balaam come from? From God. Yeah, it's coming from God. Now, Balak seems to want Balaam to kind of use the dark side, as we would think of it, divination, knowing the future, and incantation, maybe cursing a nation. You say this and it will curse this nation and they won't be able to do anything. So, we don't have a lot of information about Balaam otherwise, but it's interesting, isn't it, that God does use on this occasion someone else who's not an Israelite to prophesy for him. Which is to say, among other things, that we don't have every instance of everything that God did. There were probably other things that were done. These are recorded so that we can know about them. All right, so here is Balak, and the Israelites are down in the valley below. What about this? How does Balak persuade Balaam to come prophesy? And there's a story there. And I think we all know the story. He's riding his donkey, and the angel appears. The donkey sees it. Balaam doesn't. Balaam's ready to kill his donkey. And finally, he sees the angel, and he speaks to the donkey after the donkey speaks to him. But what's all that about? And the other kind of puzzling thing is that first this group of messengers comes from Balak, tries to persuade Balaam to go. Balaam says, no, I've got to consult God. And what's God say? No. And so they go back to Balak, and Balak says, well, I'll send more, and I'll send more money. And so they come and ask Balaam, and what's Balaam say? Well, he says, I'll ask God. See what he says. And God responds by saying, okay, go with them. All right? So I say puzzling because it seems like God says, don't go, and then he says, go. All right, so maybe we'll come back to that here in a minute. So they get everything ready up there on the mountain. So here's Balaam and Balak standing up, and here's Israel down in the valley. And so Balaam starts to prophesy. And this first oracle, he talks about God's blessing Israel. Let me get down here where I can see it. He says, Come, curse Jacob for me, and come denounce Israel. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? So you can almost imagine Balak, his jaw drops. I told you to curse these Israelites, and now Balaam says, well, I can't do that. God won't allow me to. And then look at verse 9, for from the top of the crags I see him, behold, a people dwelling alone and not counting itself among the nations. Israel is someone different. Is that true? You're going to be my elect people. You're going to be set apart from all the other nations. So what he's speaking is exactly right. And then verse 10, he says, who can count the dust of Jacob or number the fourth part of Israel? What's that sound like? He's looking at these Israelites and he says, who can count them? They're like the dust. Sounds like God speaking to whom? Abraham. Stars of the heavens, dust of the earth. Okay. And so he says, let me die the death of the upright. Let my end be like his. Balaam says, I want to be like them. So Israel is a chosen people because God has shown his love to them. All right, a second oracle. Balak doesn't give up. He says, okay, let's do this again. And so they go to a different place, and among the things that are spoken there, Balaam says, God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should not change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? So what's true of God, Balaam is saying? If he promises something, he's going to do it. So here is Israel, who are going to conquer other nations because God is who he says he is. He's faithful. He keeps his promise. And then there is a third oracle that he issues. Yet again, Balak tries to get him to curse these people. And in chapter 24, Balaam describes the blessing that God is giving his people. Verse 5, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. And then he goes to talk about their ability to destroy other nations. So this plan of Balak's isn't working, is it? It's having just the opposite effect. He's pronouncing blessing upon these people. And there is a final oracle. So I said here, a contented people because of God's blessing. And then finally in chapter 24, verses 15 to 25, he prophesies again. And a part of this one, you may recognize this, verse 17, Balaam says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Now, not a lot of detail there, but what does that seem to foretell? What's going to come from Israel? Well, yeah, ultimately Jesus, and this suggests some kind of a rule, doesn't it? A scepter shall rise out of Israel. Yeah, a king, someone who's going to rule. And compared then to Agag, I think, in the other verses, or maybe that was the previous one. All right, so 4 different times, Balaam, instead of cursing Israel, blesses Israel. And I'm sure Balak was frustrated. But in chapter 25, what we find is that something else is going on, and in chapter 31, we later find that Balaam's behind it. No, Balaam didn't curse the people. He carried out God's blessing upon them, but what did he apparently underhandedly do? That's described in chapter 25, and then Balaam's judged for it over in chapter 31. Do you remember the story? Who is encouraged to go with the Midianites and the Moabites and, commit idolatry and be a part of all that? Okay. So, yeah. Yeah, you don't really see Balaam acting in a direct way, but later, as I say in chapter 31, it does say that he encouraged the people to do this and to kind of lure the Israelites into this. Yeah, and he's judged for it, along with the Midianites. Okay. So even though God defeats his purpose in prophesying blessing upon the Israelites, Balaam seems to be interested in what he can get out of this for himself. If you go to the New Testament, there are a couple of warnings over in 2 Peter chapter 2, or a couple of statements about Balaam, 2 Peter chapter 2, and then Jude, I believe it's verse 11, that describe Balaam's activity there. It says, verse 15, forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed, this talking about false prophets. They followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing. So we said back there, Balaam said, no, I'm not going with you. And then he said, well, let me ask God again. Yes. Okay. It just seems like, yeah, Balaam is saying one thing, but his interest lies elsewhere, doesn't it? Yeah, Rick? Okay. Yeah. Sounds little bit like what we were talking about Sunday night, the circumventing God's will by doing it this way instead of that way. Yeah, not prophesying. Okay. And I read Jude 11 is similar. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error. So that seems to be at the heart of this. Balaam is trying to, profit from all of this. Okay, any other thoughts there? Good ones that you brought up. We talked about the second numbering of Israel. Notice here in chapter 26, as they go through this exercise again, and as we said, this is a second generation now being numbered. What additional reason is being given besides we're counting those who can go out to battle? What's he say here in verse 24? No, 54 is that? Yeah. This census is also going to be a basis for doing what when they take the land? Dividing it, okay? Yeah. So yeah, they're going to choose by lots, but depending on how many there are, they're allotted a certain amount of land. So they're numbered a second time. And then at the end of that chapter, chapter 27, Joshua is chosen to take the place of Moses. All right? Worthy successor. We won't go through it all, but chapter 31 and 32, there are several other nations they defeat as they make their way up around Moab, who doesn't allow them to pass. But then there are a couple of kings, Og, I think, and Sihon, and maybe the Midianites. All of them are defeated. So, yeah, they're already doing battle, aren't they? And they make their way up to this place where they're going to be addressed by Moses. That's where we get to Deuteronomy. But 2.5 tribes request land that's east of the Jordan. Who are they? Do you remember? I think I've got it. Reuben, Gad, half tribe of Manasseh. Okay. What's that land over there on the east side of the Sea of Galilee? What's it called? You hear it today. Bashan? Okay. Golan Heights, isn't that up in that area as well? So, it's yeah, okay. So it was known because it was good land, and they wanted to be able to settle there. But they had to agree to do what? You can have this land, but first we got to do what? You got to go in and take the land, okay? All right, we got a few minutes here. Let's think about what we've studied. Already had some good comments about things we can learn. Well, we learn about God, don't we, in this whole section? Isn't that one of the main reasons to tell all of this? Well, what do we learn about God in the book of Numbers? He keeps his promises. He demands holiness, obedience. I mean, think of Moses. All of this that he did over 120 years, and he's not able to enter in. And faithful in a lot of ways, but in this one instance he wasn't. Go ahead, Rick. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So God keeps his promises despite Israel's disobedience at times. God's long-suffering in many ways. Anything we learn about life in the book of Numbers? Okay. Hard way, easy way. What else? What else can you take away from? Yeah, the need for obedience, very much so. Try not to complain. Yeah, I think that certainly comes to the front over and over again, doesn't it? George? Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, God needed to be at the center of their life, and to the degree they respect that, they benefit, or they, yeah. George, what was your comment? Okay. Okay. All right. Very good. Is life full of ups and downs? I think that's true for everybody, isn't it? I mean, it may look really good for someone sometime from a distance, but there are the highs and the lows, aren't there? We learn anything about ourselves in this book? Yeah. Okay. We can be a lot like them, can't we? And that's important, that we just see ourselves. We put ourselves in their place and ask, what would I do? What am I doing? And I think that can help us. We learn about faith. What would you say about faith based on what we studied? A, it's important. Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's not just momentary. It's got to be constant. And God's really given them some things to build their faith in Him, hasn't He? I mean, by the things He's done, by this whole system of holiness that we've been talking about. And so that faith is certainly important. Yeah, Rick? Yeah. Okay. Faith is the victory. It will bring about that victory if we are faithful. What about the importance of one believer? Maybe we could say two. What if everybody else is going the other way? Does it matter what I do? Yeah, it sure does. Yeah. So, we've got to put our trust in God and act based on what He tells us to do and act obediently. All right. Yeah, Michael. Okay. Okay. And maybe something we can add to that is God made some distinctions between who had what responsibility, and He had that right. And each was to act within the framework of that. All right, next time Rick is going to be teaching first few chapters of Deuteronomy. Look at the lesson sheet. There are some great statements in Deuteronomy chapters 1 to 10. And I think they've been highlighted on the lesson sheet. But just look at some of those statements, and I think we often refer to those, preach from those, and they're worth preaching from.